The howling wind carried dust and desperation through the streets of Val Verde, Texas, as Beatrice Zeller clutched her swollen belly and sank against the rough wooden exterior of Mullen's General Store. 6 months pregnant and 3 days without a proper meal, she watched through hazy vision as townspeople hurried past, their eyes deliberately avoiding the disheveled woman whose wedding ring had been pawned 2 towns back to buy bread. Spring of 1872 had brought unexpected warmth to the Texas border town, but Beatrice felt nothing but cold dread as she contemplated her circumstances. 22 years old, widow to a man she'd barely known, and carrying a child who would enter the world with nothing but a desperate mother. Her husband's sudden death from fever had left her with debts she couldn't pay and relatives who refused to acknowledge her existence after she'd married against their wishes. "You still here?" The shopkeeper's gruff voice startled her as he swept the boardwalk in front of his establishment. "Told you yesterday, no loitering, bad for business." Beatrice attempted to stand, her trembling legs betraying her. "I'll move along, sir, see that you do." The man turned away, muttering something about fallen women that made Beatrice's cheeks burn with shame despite her innocence. She had been a schoolteacher before her hasty marriage, respectable and educated, though neither qualifications seemed to matter now. Her late husband's gambling debts had consumed what little they had, and his promises of a fresh start in Texas had died with him on the journey west. The sun was beginning to set when Beatrice's vision swam and darkened around the edges. She hadn't noticed the approaching rider, a tall figure on a chestnut stallion that came to a halt directly in front of her. Through the haze of hunger and exhaustion, she registered the broad shoulders, the dust-covered hat, and most clearly the concerned eyes that studied her with unexpected gentleness. "Madam," his voice was deep, carrying the subtle drawl of a Texan native, "are you all right?" Beatrice tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Her pride, the last possession she truly owned, made her attempt to straighten and nod, but her body betrayed her as she swayed dangerously. In one fluid motion, the stranger dismounted and moved to her side, a strong arm catching her before she could collapse. "Easy now," he murmured, helping her to sit on the edge of the boardwalk. "I don't need charity," Beatrice managed weakly, even as her stomach growled audibly. The man she noticed now, he wore the practical clothing of a rancher rather than the flashy gear of a gunslinger, ignored her protest. "Wait here," he instructed, tying his horse to the hitching post before disappearing into the general store. Beatrice considered fleeing, though she had nowhere to go. Before she could decide, he returned with a paper-wrapped package and a canteen. "Eat," he said simply, unwrapping bread, cheese, and dried beef. When she hesitated, he added gently, "Please, for the little one if not for yourself." His acknowledgement of her pregnancy without judgment broke something inside Beatrice. Tears welled as she accepted the food, trying to maintain dignity by eating slowly, though she wanted to devour everything at once. "Henry O'Malley," he introduced himself, keeping a respectful distance while she ate. "I run the Double Circle Ranch about 10 miles out of town." "Beatrice Zeller," she replied between careful bites. "Mrs. Beatrice Zeller." She emphasized her marital status, though she wasn't sure why it mattered to clarify this to a stranger. Henry nodded, his expression revealing nothing about whether he believed her. "Where are you staying, Mrs. Zeller?" Beatrice looked away, unwilling to admit she had nowhere. She'd been sleeping in a stable until the owner had discovered her that morning. Henry seemed to understand her silence. He took a breath, considering his words carefully before speaking. "I've got a proposition, Mrs. Zeller. My ranch needs a housekeeper. The previous one left to get married 2 months back, and the place is showing it." He gestured to the flour dust still visible on his sleeve. "There's a small cabin behind the main house, private. It would be yours while you work for me." Beatrice stopped chewing, suspicion narrowing her eyes. "Why would you offer employment to a woman in my condition?" "Because you need work and I need help," he answered simply. "And because no woman carrying a child should be sleeping on the streets of Val Verde. It's not safe." She studied him carefully, the sun-weathered face, the honest blue eyes, the way he maintained a respectful distance. At perhaps 30 years of age, Henry O'Malley didn't fit her image of the dangerous cowboys who frequented the saloons. "I don't know the first thing about keeping house on a ranch," she admitted. A slight smile touched his lips. "Can you cook better than I can? Because that's not saying much." Despite herself, Beatrice felt an answering smile tug at her mouth. "I can cook. Then you're already an improvement." He stood and extended a hand. "Come home with me, Mrs. Zeller, at least until you figure out your next steps. The baby shouldn't have to wait." Something in his expression, earnest without pity, made the decision for her. Beatrice took his offered hand and allowed him to help her to her feet. "I can pay you fair wages," Henry continued, "and you'll have Sundays to yourself. If it doesn't suit you after a week, I'll bring you back to town with enough money for the stagecoach." It was more generosity than she'd encountered since her husband's death. "Why?" she couldn't help asking. Henry paused in adjusting his horse's saddle. "My mother found herself in a situation not unlike yours once," he said quietly. "Someone helped her. I'm just passing along the favor." With that simple explanation, he helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her, maintaining a respectful distance while still ensuring she wouldn't fall. As they rode out of Val Verde, Beatrice felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching her departure with the rancher. She knew what they would think, what they would say, but for the first time in months, she was too tired and too grateful to care. The Double Circle Ranch materialized as the last light of day painted the Texas landscape in amber and gold. A modest but well-maintained main house stood at the center of several outbuildings, with corrals holding horses and cattle visible beyond. What struck Beatrice most was the careful organization of the property, a man's touch, certainly, but one that valued order and function. "It's not much," Henry said as he helped her dismount, "but it's peaceful." Two ranch hands approached from the barn, curiosity evident in their expressions as they took in the unexpected visitor. "Boys, this is Mrs. Zeller. She'll be taking over as housekeeper," Henry announced with a tone that invited no questions. "Tom, would you show her to the cabin while I stable Rusty and ask Miguel if he can spare some of that stew from supper?" The older of the two men nodded respectfully. "Yes, boss." "Madam, if you'll follow me." Beatrice followed, conscious of her threadbare dress and disheveled appearance. The cabin, when they reached it, was small but sturdy, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small stove, and a rocking chair by the window. "Mr. O'Malley had this built for his mother," Tom explained, lighting the lamp. "She passed last winter, influenza." The information added dimension to Henry's earlier explanation about his mother. "I'm sorry for his loss," Beatrice said sincerely. "She was a good woman." Tom nodded. "I'll fetch that stew and some fresh water. There's a trunk with some of her things in the corner there. Mr. O'Malley said you might make use of them until you can get your own." When she was alone, Beatrice sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden turn her fortunes had taken. The trunk, when she finally gathered courage to open it, contained simple but well-made dresses that would accommodate her growing shape, along with basic necessities any woman would need. Later, after she'd eaten the promised stew and changed into a clean nightgown, a soft knock at the door revealed Henry with an additional blanket. "Nights get cold," he explained, handing it to her without crossing the threshold. "Breakfast is usually at sunrise, but take your time tomorrow." "Get your bearings, Mr. O'Malley," Beatrice said, finding her voice. "I don't know how to thank you." "Henry," he corrected gently, "and there's no need. A hot meal on the table will be thanks enough." He tipped his hat slightly. "Good night, Mrs. Zeller." "Beatrice," she offered in return, surprising herself. "If we're to work together." His smile was brief but genuine. "Good night then, Beatrice. Rest well." As he walked back toward the main house, Beatrice closed the door and leaned against it, one hand unconsciously cradling her belly. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she and her child might find safety after all. The next morning, Beatrice woke with the sun, determined to prove her worth. She dressed in one of the simpler dresses from the trunk, grateful that Henry's mother had been a woman of practical taste. The garment hung loosely except at her middle, but it was clean and whole, which was more than she could say for her own clothing. She found the kitchen empty but for Miguel, a middle-aged Mexican man who introduced himself as the ranch cook. "Senor Henry says you take over the house," he said with a friendly nod. "I help you learn where things are, then I go back to the bunkhouse cooking for the men." Beatrice appreciated his kindness as he showed her the pantry, explained which dishes Henry preferred, and pointed out the garden where vegetables grew in neat rows. "The boss, he tries," Miguel said with a laugh, gesturing to the somewhat overgrown garden, "but plants, they need a woman's touch, I think." By the time Henry and the ranch hands came in for breakfast, Beatrice had managed to prepare a respectable meal of biscuits, eggs, and bacon. She felt a surprising flutter of satisfaction when Henry took his first bite and his eyebrows rose in appreciation. "Mrs. Zeller," he said, "I believe I've made an excellent decision in hiring you." The men murmured their agreement, and Beatrice felt color rise in her cheeks. It was a small accomplishment, but after months of failure and loss, it felt monumental. The days fell into a pattern. Beatrice would rise early to prepare breakfast, then spend her mornings cleaning the main house, a four-room structure consisting of a kitchen, a sitting room, Henry's bedroom, and a small study. Afternoons were devoted to laundry, mending, and tending the garden, which responded quickly to her care. By the end of her first week, she had transformed the bachelor's house into something approaching a home, with clean curtains, polished furniture, and fresh-cut wildflowers on the table. Henry, for his part, maintained a respectful distance. He was unfailingly polite, expressing appreciation for her work, but never intruding on her privacy. He ate his meals quickly before returning to ranch work, though occasionally in the evenings he would linger over coffee, answering her questions about the operation of the ranch. "Cattle's our main business," he explained one evening as she darned a sock by lamplight. "Not the biggest spread in Texas by any means, but the Double Circle has good water rights and strong bloodlines in our herd. You built all this yourself?" Beatrice asked, curious about the man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. Henry's expression grew distant. "My father started it. Came out here from Missouri after the war, the first one with Mexico, got the original land grant and built the first cabin right where this house stands now." "And your mother, you mentioned she had been in circumstances like mine," he studied his coffee cup before answering. "She was 16 when she found herself widowed and expecting me. My father had been killed in a dispute over cattle. A neighbor took her and gave her work shelter." He looked up. "She never forgot that kindness, neither have I," Beatrice nodded, understanding better now. "She raised you alone then, until I was 10. Then she married Tom's father, good man, treated us both well until he passed 5 years ago." Henry stood, clearly uncomfortable with sharing too much personal history. "If you'll excuse me, I need to check the new foal before turning in." As the days passed, Beatrice found herself watching Henry with growing interest. He was not a man of many words, but his actions spoke volumes. The way he treated his horses gently but firmly, how he listened attentively when his ranch hands spoke, his habit of removing his hat and boots before entering the freshly swept house. At the beginning of her third week at Double Circle, Beatrice was hanging laundry when she felt the baby kick, a strong, decisive movement that made her gasp and place both hands on her belly. She was so absorbed in the sensation that she didn't notice Henry approaching until he spoke. "Everything all right?" Concern laced his voice. Beatrice smiled, spontaneous and genuine. "Yes, the baby he's kicking, would you?" She stopped herself, suddenly aware of the impropriety of what she'd been about to suggest, but Henry seemed to understand. With characteristic respect, he asked, "May I?" At her nod, he carefully placed his calloused hand where she indicated. When the baby kicked again, his face transformed with wonder. "Strong little one," he said softly. "Like his father," Beatrice replied automatically, then felt a stab of guilt. She had barely known her husband, their marriage a hasty affair after a brief courtship, and what she had learned of him after his death had been largely disappointing. Henry seemed to sense her discomfort. He withdrew his hand and changed the subject. "I'm riding into town tomorrow for supplies." "Is there anything you need?" Beatrice considered. "Thread, if you wouldn't mind, and perhaps some fabric for baby clothes." "Of course." He hesitated, then added, "I was thinking if you're feeling up to it, you might want to come along, get out of the ranch for a bit." The thought of returning to Val Verde filled Beatrice with apprehension. I'm not sure that's wise. People talk, Henry acknowledged. But they'll talk whether you're there to hear it or not. Might as well give them something genuine to talk about instead of their imaginings. There was wisdom in his words, Beatrice realized, and perhaps it was time to face the town that had nearly seen her demise. All right, I'll come. The journey to town the next day was far more comfortable than her previous exit had been. Henry had hitched a wagon with a padded seat, and the spring morning was pleasantly warm without being oppressive. Beatrice wore one of the nicer dresses from the trunk, altered to fit her changing shape, and had twisted her dark hair into a neat arrangement beneath a modest bonnet. Val Verde appeared different in the clarity of her improved circumstances, less threatening, more simply a frontier town going about its business. Still, she felt eyes tracking their progress as Henry helped her down from the wagon in front of the general store. Inside, the shopkeeper who had chased her from his boardwalk barely concealed his surprise at seeing her return on the arm of one of the area's respected ranchers. His greeting was stiff but polite. "Mr. O'Malley. Mrs. Zeller, isn't it? What can I help you with today?" Henry placed their order for ranch supplies while Beatrice selected sewing materials. She was examining spools of thread when she overheard two women whispering behind the fabric bolts. Living out at his ranch now, can you imagine? And in her condition. "Well, I heard her husband wasn't really her husband at all, just some drifter she took up with." Henry O'Malley ought to know better. His mother raised him proper, God rest her soul. Beatrice's hands trembled as she replaced the spool she'd been holding. She'd expected gossip, but the reality of hearing it still stung. A shadow fell across the notions table as Henry appeared at her side. His voice, when he spoke, was pitched to carry just far enough for the gossiping women to hear. "Have you found everything you need, Mrs. Zeller, doctor? Winters mentioned he'd be happy to see you today to check on the baby's progress, if you're amenable." Beatrice glanced up in surprise. They'd made no plans to see a doctor, but quickly understood his intention. "Yes, that would be most appreciated, Mr. O'Malley." The whispering behind the fabric bolts ceased abruptly. Henry offered his arm with a slight smile that told her he knew exactly what he was doing. "Shall we finish our business here and pay the doctor a visit then?" Outside, Beatrice couldn't contain a small laugh. "There was no doctor's appointment, was there?" "There is now," Henry replied, helping her back into the wagon. "Dr. Winters is a good man, and it wouldn't hurt to have him check on you, if you're willing, of course." The concern in his voice touched her. "That's very thoughtful. But you don't need to go to such lengths to protect my reputation." "I'm not protecting your reputation," Henry said, his voice uncharacteristically firm. "I'm defending your dignity. There's a difference." He picked up the reins. "Those women in there, they don't know you. They don't know what you've endured or the strength it took to survive it, but I do." The simplicity of his statement left Beatrice momentarily speechless. When she found her voice, she said quietly, "Thank you, Henry." The visit to Dr. Winters proved genuinely beneficial. The elderly physician confirmed that both Beatrice and the baby appeared healthy, though he recommended additional rest and continued good nutrition. "You found yourself in good hands with O'Malley," the doctor commented as he completed his examination. "Known him since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. Solid man." "He's been very kind," Beatrice agreed. Adjusting her clothing, Dr. Winters gave her a shrewd look. "Kind, yes, but there's more than kindness in the way that man watches over you." Before Beatrice could respond to this unexpected observation, the doctor continued briskly. "I'll expect to see you again in a month. Sooner if there's any pain or bleeding. That baby looks to be due in early August by my reckoning." The ride back to the ranch was quieter, both Henry and Beatrice absorbed in their own thoughts. The doctor's words echoed in Beatrice's mind, causing her to steal glances at the man beside her. Could there be truth in what Dr. Winters had implied? And if so, what did that mean for her for them? As if sensing her scrutiny, Henry spoke without taking his eyes from the road. "I hope the visit to town wasn't too difficult for you." "No," she said thoughtfully. "In fact, it was rather illuminating." He glanced at her then, a question in his eyes, but she simply smiled and turned her face to the horizon, where the silhouette of the Double Circle Ranch was just becoming visible in the distance. That evening, as Beatrice prepared supper, She found herself humming softly, a habit from her teaching days that she had all but abandoned during the dark months following her husband's death. The simple tune filled the kitchen as she moved between stove and table, setting out plates for herself and Henry. She had just placed a dish of fried chicken on the table when a crash from outside interrupted her preparations. Running to the door, she saw Henry on the ground next to the corral, clutching his leg as a young, agitated horse pranced nervously nearby. "Henry," she hurried toward him, awkward in her pregnancy but driven by concern. Two ranch hands were already at his side, helping him to sit up. "Boss took a bad kick," Tom explained as Beatrice approached. "That new Mustang is still half wild." Henry's face was pale beneath his tan, his jaw clenched against the pain. "I'm fine," he insisted, though the unnatural angle of his lower leg belied his words. "You're not fine," Beatrice said firmly. "That leg needs setting. Tom, help me get him to the house." Between the three of them, they managed to support Henry to his bedroom, where he collapsed onto the bed with a barely suppressed groan. "Send someone for Dr. Winters," Beatrice instructed Tom. "And bring me clean cloths, hot water, and whiskey." When they were alone, Beatrice carefully removed Henry's boot and cut away his pant leg to reveal a compound fracture, the white edge of bone visible through torn flesh. "That bad, huh?" Henry asked, watching her face. Beatrice schooled her expression to hide her alarm. "I've seen worse," she lied. "The doctor will have you fixed up in no time." "Liar," he said, but with a weak smile. "Always were a terrible poker player." It was a testament to his pain that he allowed her to help him drink the whiskey she offered, and another indication when he didn't protest, as she began cleaning the wound as best she could. By the time Dr. Winters arrived, nearly 2 hours later, Henry was feverish, drifting in and out of consciousness. The setting of the bone was a brutal process that required Tom and another ranch hand to hold Henry down while the doctor worked. Beatrice remained at his side throughout, wiping his brow and murmuring reassurances she wasn't sure he could hear. "He's strong," Dr. Winters said when it was done, the leg splinted and bandaged. "But he'll need careful tending. Fever's the biggest danger now with that open wound." "I'll stay with him," Beatrice said without hesitation. The doctor gave her a concerned look. "You need rest yourself in your condition. I can rest right here." She indicated the armchair she'd already pulled beside the bed. "Please, I want to help him, as he helped me, doctor." Winters studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. Keep the wound clean, change the bandages twice daily. If the skin around it turns red or hot, or if his fever worsens, send for me immediately." The next 3 days blurred together as Beatrice maintained her vigil. She bathed Henry's face with cool cloths when fever gripped him, changed his bandages with gentle hands, and spooned broth between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. Through it all, she spoke to him, telling stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, describing the antics of her school pupils, even reading aloud from the books in his small collection. In his feverish state, Henry sometimes spoke as well-disjointed memories of his mother, fragments of cattle transactions, and occasionally words directed at Beatrice herself that made her breath catch. "Beautiful," he murmured once, his fever-bright eyes fixed on her face. "Like sunlight." "Hush," she had whispered, brushing damp hair from his forehead. "Save your strength." On the 4th morning, Beatrice woke from an uncomfortable doze in the armchair to find Henry watching her, his eyes clear for the first time since the accident. "You're still here," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. Relief flooded through her. "Where else would I be? You should be resting." "The baby is fine," she assured him, moving to check his forehead. "Cool, finally. Your fever's broken." Henry caught her hand as she withdrew it, his grip weak but deliberate. "Thank you, Beatrice, for staying." The simple gratitude in his eyes stirred something deep within her, something she'd thought lost when she'd been widowed and abandoned to the mercy of frontier society. Before she could examine the feeling too closely, a knock at the door announced Miguel with a breakfast tray. "The boss is awake," the cook exclaimed with evident relief. "Gracias a Dios, the men, they have been very worried." Henry released Beatrice's hand as Miguel entered, but his eyes followed her as she moved about the room, straightening blankets and arranging pillows to help him sit up. His recovery progressed steadily after that. Within a week, he was able to sit in a chair by the window, watching the ranch operations with frustrated immobility but growing strength. Beatrice continued to tend his wound and bring his meals, though she insisted on returning to her cabin at night once the immediate danger had passed. "You should let Miguel help more," Henry said one afternoon as she changed his bandage. "You're doing too much." Beatrice gently wrapped fresh gauze around his leg. "I don't mind. Besides, you did no less for me when I needed help." That was different, was it? She secured the bandage and looked up at him. "You gave me shelter when I had none, work when I needed purpose, and dignity when others would have denied it to me. Let me repay some small portion of that debt." Henry's expression softened. "There is no debt between us, Beatrice." The sincerity in his voice made her pause. Over the weeks of her employment, and especially during his convalescence, something had shifted between them, a subtle transformation from employer and employee to something less defined, but somehow more significant. Before she could respond, a sharp pain gripped her abdomen, causing her to gasp and brace herself against the bed. Henry leaned forward in alarm. "What is it? The baby?" "Just a twinge," Beatrice assured him, though uncertainty colored her voice. At 7 months along, it was too early for labor, but the pain had been unmistakable. "I'm sending for Dr. Winters," Henry said firmly. "There's no need." Another pain cut off her protest, stronger this time. Fear flashed across her face as she clutched her belly. Perhaps that would be wise. The doctor arrived to find Beatrice lying on her own bed in the cabin, her face drawn with concern as irregular contractions continued to come and go. After examining her, he delivered a cautiously optimistic prognosis. "False labor, most likely," he said, "though we need to be careful. Complete bed rest for at least a week, longer if the contractions continue." "A week," Beatrice protested. "But the house, the meals, Henry's care, can all be managed," Henry said from the doorway, where he stood leaning heavily on a crutch. Despite her objections, he had insisted on hobbling to the cabin to hear the doctor's assessment himself. "Your only job now is to rest." Dr. Winters nodded in agreement. "The rancher's right, Mrs. Zeller. That baby needs more time, and the only way to ensure it gets it is for you to stay off your feet." Reluctantly, Beatrice agreed to the prescribed rest. What followed was a reversal of roles that might have been comical under different circumstances. Henry, still healing himself, supervising the preparation of meals that were delivered to her cabin, and Miguel taking over the household duties with enthusiastic, if somewhat haphazard, results. On the third day of her confinement, Beatrice was startled by a knock on her door mid-afternoon, outside the usual meal delivery times. When she called permission to enter, she was surprised to find Henry, balancing on his crutch with one hand while the other held a battered checkerboard. "Thought you might be getting bored," he explained, moving awkwardly to the small table by her bed. "I know I nearly lost my mind when I was laid up." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought unexpected tears to Beatrice's eyes, which she quickly blinked away. "That's very kind." "But shouldn't you be resting your leg?" Henry settled into the chair with a wry smile. "Doctor said I need to start putting some weight on it. Short walks, nothing strenuous." He set up the checkerboard. "Besides, I've been wanting a rematch since you trounced me last week." Their game stretched into 2, then 3, accompanied by easy conversation that ranged from ranch business to books they'd read to childhood memories. As twilight approached, Henry reluctantly prepared to leave. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, gathering the checkers. Beatrice nodded, surprised by how much she was looking forward to it. "I'll be here, not that I have much choice." Henry paused at the door, his expression serious. "Beatrice, I know this isn't the life you planned, but I want you to know," he stopped, seeming to search for words. "You have a place here, you and the baby both, for as long as you want it." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to articulate. "Thank you," Beatrice said softly. "That means more than I can say." Their daily checkers games became a ritual during Beatrice's week of bed rest, expanding to include other games and sometimes simply conversation as Henry shared the day's events on the ranch and Beatrice offered suggestions or observations. By the time Dr. Winters declared she could resume light activities, Beatrice realized with some surprise that she had come to treasure these hours with Henry more than she'd anticipated. As July's heat settled over the Texas landscape, turning the grass golden and the air shimmering, both invalids continued their recovery. Henry began spending more time outside supervising ranch work, though still restricted from riding or heavy labor. Beatrice, now in her 8th month of pregnancy, moved more slowly but insisted on resuming most of her household duties. One evening, as they sat on the porch after supper watching the sunset paint the western sky in vivid oranges and purples, Henry broached a subject that had clearly been on his mind. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice deliberately casual. "The baby will be here soon." Beatrice nodded, her hand automatically moving to her rounded belly. "Another month, according to Dr. Winters. Have you thought about, after?" Henry kept his eyes on the horizon as he spoke. "Your plans, I mean." The question caught Beatrice off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Her employment at Double Circle had always been presented as temporary a lifeline until she could determine her next steps. But in the months since her arrival, those next steps had become increasingly difficult to envision. The ranch had become home in a way no place had since her parents' house in Pennsylvania. "I haven't decided," she admitted. "I had thought perhaps to return to teaching eventually, but with a child." She trailed off, the practical difficulties obvious to both of them. Henry was silent for a long moment before speaking again. "You could stay here." "As your housekeeper?" Beatrice asked carefully. He turned to look at her then, the fading light casting his features in soft shadow. "If that's what you want, or," he took a deep breath, "or as my wife." The words hung in the evening air, as delicate and significant as the first stars appearing overhead. Beatrice's heart raced as she searched his face, finding nothing but sincere emotion in his steady gaze. "Henry," she began, then paused, uncertain how to respond to a proposal she hadn't anticipated yet somehow had been moving toward all along. "I'm carrying another man's child." "I know that," he said gently. "I'm not asking to replace anyone, Beatrice. But I care for you more than I expected to when I brought you here, and I'll care for the child too if you'll let me." "Is it pity?" she had to ask, though she feared the answer. "Because I don't want that, not from you especially." "Not pity," Henry replied, reaching across the space between their chairs to take her hand. "Respect, admiration." A slight smile touched his lips. "And quite a bit more than that, if I'm honest with myself." Beatrice felt tears threaten, emotion welling up at his simple declaration. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to answer now," he assured her. "Think about it. Talk to the doctor if you're concerned about the baby. I just wanted you to know how I feel, what I hope for." She squeezed his hand, a gesture that conveyed what she wasn't yet ready to put into words. "I will think about it, but Henry," she met his eyes steadily, "you should know that this place, this ranch, has become home to me in ways I never expected, and you," she faltered, then continued with quiet certainty, "you have become very dear to me." The smile that spread across Henry's face was like sunrise breaking over the plains, gradual, then suddenly brilliant. They sat in companionable silence as darkness settled over the ranch, hands still linked, possibilities stretching before them like the vast Texas sky. 3 days later, Beatrice was in the garden harvesting vegetables for supper when the first contraction hit stronger and more insistent than the false labor pains she'd experienced weeks earlier. She gripped the edge of the garden fence, breathing through the sensation as Dr. Winters had instructed. When it passed, she straightened and began making her way toward the house, only to be stopped by a second contraction before she'd gone 10 steps. "Miguel," she called, seeing the cook crossing the yard. "Please find Mr. O'Malley." "Tell him," she broke off as another pain gripped her. "Tell him it's time." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and determination. Henry had immediately sent for Dr. Winters and the midwife from town, then helped Beatrice to her cabin before being firmly but kindly banished by the midwife when she arrived. "Men have no place in birthing rooms," the older woman declared. "Go pace the porch like fathers have been doing since the beginning of time." And pace he did, his recently healed leg protesting but ignored as he wore a path in the boards outside Beatrice's cabin. Every cry that escaped through the closed door pierced him like a physical blow. Tom eventually brought him a chair and a cup of coffee that grew cold as the labor progressed into evening, then night. Just after midnight, when the ranch was quiet except for the occasional low of cattle and the persistent chorus of crickets, a new sound broke the stillness, the indignant wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Henry's head snapped up from where he'd been resting it in his hands, eyes fixed on the door as he held his own breath in anticipation. It seemed an eternity before the door finally opened and the midwife appeared, her lined face tired but smiling. "You can come in now," she said. "Mother and son are waiting for you, son." The word echoed in Henry's mind as he rose on legs that felt suddenly unsteady. He entered the cabin to find Beatrice propped up on pillows, her face drawn with exhaustion but radiant as she cradled a small bundle wrapped in a white blanket. "Henry," she said softly as he approached the bed, "meet William Henry Zeller." The middle name was not lost on him, and emotion threatened to choke him as he carefully sat on the edge of the bed. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the infant. Beatrice nodded, gently transferring the swaddled baby to his arms. Henry looked down at the tiny red face, the shock of dark hair, the perfect miniature fingers that curled around his calloused thumb when he offered it. "He's perfect," Henry whispered, awe evident in his voice. "Just like his mother." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears at the tenderness in his expression. "I've been thinking about what you asked me," she said. "About staying." Henry looked up, hope and uncertainty warring in his eyes. "And I'd like that very much," she replied, reaching out to touch his arm. "For us to stay, for us to be a family if the offer still stands." Henry carefully returned the baby to her arms before leaning forward to press his lips to her forehead. "The offer stands," he murmured against her skin. "Now and always." The midwife discreetly slipped out to join Dr. Winters on the porch, leaving the new family to their private moment of joy and promise. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, a small affair in the front parlor of the main house with Dr. Winters, the ranch hands, and a few of Henry's business associates as witnesses. Beatrice wore a simple cream-colored dress that Miguel's wife had helped her alter, and carried a bouquet of late summer wildflowers gathered from the pastures of Double Circle. William, already growing sturdy, slept peacefully in a basket beside the makeshift altar where the circuit preacher waited to unite his mother and the man who had chosen to become his father in every way that mattered. As Beatrice spoke her vows, she marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment, from desperate widow on the streets of Val Verde to beloved wife and mother on a thriving Texas ranch. Henry's steady voice as he promised to cherish and protect her and William confirmed what she already knew in her heart: that true family could be found in the most unexpected places, and that love, when genuine, asked not about the past but looked toward the future. Their first months of marriage were not without challenges. William's nighttime crying tested their patience, and the adjustment to their new relationship required careful navigation. But each challenge was met with the same resilience that had characterized their individual lives before they found each other. By the time William celebrated his first birthday, the Double Circle Ranch had expanded its operations, adding a small horse breeding program to complement the cattle business. Henry's sound management and Beatrice's careful bookkeeping had resulted in a profitable year, allowing them to hire additional hands and begin planning improvements to the main house. "I was thinking we might add a proper nursery," Henry mentioned one evening as they sat on the porch, watching William take unsteady steps across the yard under Tom's watchful eye. "The study could be converted easily enough." Beatrice gave him a thoughtful look. "Actually, I was wondering if we might need more space than just one nursery could provide." Henry turned to her, comprehension dawning slowly. "Beatrice, are you saying?" She nodded, unable to contain her smile. "Dr. Winters confirmed it yesterday. We'll have another little O'Malley joining us come winter." The joy that spread across Henry's face was answer enough, but he pulled her into his arms anyway, his embrace gentle but fervent. "I love you," he whispered against her hair, "more than I ever thought possible." "And I love you," she replied, resting her head against his shoulder. for the man you are and for the life you've given us." As twilight settled over the Double Circle Ranch, Beatrice reflected on that first meeting, a starving, desperate woman, and the cowboy who had offered not just food but dignity, respect, and eventually his heart. From that simple act of kindness had grown a love as vast and enduring as the Texas landscape that surrounded them, a love that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead, and a home where their children would grow in security and happiness. The evening breeze carried the scent of sage and promise as William toddled back to them, reaching up with chubby hands to be lifted onto the porch. Henry scooped him up, settling the boy on his knee as naturally as if he'd been born to it. "Papa," William declared, one of the few words in his developing vocabulary, and Henry's eyes met Beatrice's over their son's head, sharing a moment of profound gratitude for the family they had created together. As the first stars appeared overhead, Beatrice said a silent prayer of thanksgiving for the journey that had brought her to this place, for the hunger that had led to nourishment, the desperation that had led to hope, and the loneliness that had led, at last, to love. In the years that followed, the Double Circle Ranch prospered under Henry and Beatrice's stewardship. William grew into a strong, thoughtful boy who inherited his mother's quick mind and his father's steady character. He was joined by a sister, Emma Grace, born on a snowy December night, and later by twin brothers, James and Joseph, who arrived during a spectacular Texas thunderstorm that ranch hands would recount for years afterward. The O'Malley family became known throughout the county for their hospitality and fairness in business dealings. Beatrice, drawing on her teaching background, established a small school for the children of neighboring ranches, conducting lessons in the expanded main house during winter months when ranch work slowed. Henry, watching his wife nurture both their children and their community, often reflected on that fateful day in Val Verde when he'd first seen her, a desperate woman fighting to survive despite overwhelming odds. The courage she had shown then continued to manifest in everything she did, from mediating disputes between their headstrong sons to facing down a banker who had tried to deny loans to Mexican ranchers in the area. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Henry surprised Beatrice with a trip to San Antonio, their first substantial journey away from the ranch since their marriage. They left the children in the capable care of Miguel and his wife, who had moved into an expanded cabin on the property years earlier. "I can't believe you arranged all this without my knowledge," Beatrice said as they settled into their hotel room, the finest the city had to offer. "You've become quite the conspirator, Henry O'Malley." He smiled, the years having added distinguished lines around his eyes but taken nothing from the warmth of his expression. "I had considerable help. Even William kept the secret, though I think bribing him with that new pony might have helped." Beatrice laughed, the sound as delightful to Henry as it had been the first time he'd heard it. "Our son drives a hard bargain. I wonder where he gets that from." "His mother, undoubtedly," Henry replied, drawing her into his arms. "The same woman who once convinced me that hiring a pregnant stranger was a sound business decision." "The soundest you ever made," she countered, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. "At least, that's what you told the Cattlemen's Association last spring." Their kiss deepened, the passion between them undiminished by the passing years or the demands of ranch life and parenthood. When they finally parted, Henry rested his forehead against hers, savoring the moment of privacy so rare in their busy household. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small velvet box. It's not much, but Beatrice opened it to find a delicate gold locket, intricately engraved with the Double Circle brand. Inside were miniature portraits of their 4 children, painted by an artist who had visited the ranch the previous month under the guise of documenting Texas ranching life. "Oh, Henry," she breathed, tears welling in her eyes. "It's beautiful." "Not as beautiful as the life you've given me," he replied, his voice husky with emotion. "When I brought you home that day, I thought I was offering shelter to someone in need. I never imagined I was finding the other half of my heart." Beatrice carefully closed the locket and pressed it to her chest before looking up at her husband, seeing in his face the same steadfast love that had transformed her life. "We found each other," she corrected gently, "and in doing so, we found home." That night, as they dined in the hotel's elegant restaurant, Beatrice found herself reflecting on the meandering path that had led her to this moment of contentment. The loss of her first husband, painful as it had been, had ultimately guided her to Val Verde and to Henry. The hardships she had endured had given her strength she might never have discovered otherwise. "What are you thinking about?" Henry asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "About how life rarely takes the path we expect," she replied, "and how grateful I am for that fact." He reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb brushing over the simple gold band he had placed there a decade earlier. "To unexpected paths," he said, raising his glass in a toast, "and to the courage to follow them," Beatrice added, touching her glass to his. As they returned to the double circle a week later, they were greeted by the sight of their children racing down the lane to meet them, William leading the way on his new pony while the younger ones followed on foot, their excited voices carrying on the clear Texas air. "Welcome home." They chorused as the wagon approached, and Henry and Beatrice exchanged a glance of shared joy and understanding. Home. Not just a place, but a feeling of belonging, of purpose, of love freely given and gratefully received. From the moment Henry had offered his hand to a desperate woman on the streets of Val Verde, through all the seasons of growth and change that followed, they had been building this home together, brick by metaphorical brick, day by ordinary extraordinary day. As William helped his mother down from the wagon and Emma threw her arms around her father's waist, Beatrice looked up at the ranch house expanded and improved over the years, but still fundamentally the same place where she had first found shelter. The garden she had nurtured flourished in the summer sunshine. The corrals were filled with healthy livestock, and all around them stretched the land that had sustained generations before them and would support generations to come. In that moment, watching Henry swing the twins up into his arms amid peals of laughter, Beatrice offered silent thanks for hunger that had led to fullness, for desperation that had opened the door to joy, and for the simple words "come home" that had changed her life forever. The years continued to flow, marked by the rhythms of ranch life having seasons and cattle drives, planting and harvest, the gradual maturing of their children into capable young adults who contributed to the family enterprise in their own unique ways. William, now 20, had his father's head for business and was increasingly taking on responsibility for cattle trading. Emma, at 19, had inherited her mother's intelligence and teaching ability, assisting Beatrice with the ranch school while developing a remarkable talent for horse breeding. The twins, at 16, were still finding their paths, though James showed promise as a natural horseman while Joseph displayed mechanical aptitude that had revolutionized several ranch operations. As Beatrice approached her 45th birthday, she sometimes marveled at the fullness of her life, so different from the bleakness she had faced that day in Val Verde more than 2 decades earlier. The Double Circle Ranch had grown into one of the most respected operations in the county, and the O'Malley family was known for both their business acumen and their community involvement. Henry, now in his early 50s, had weathered the years with the same quiet strength that had first drawn her to him, though silver now threaded his hair and the lines around his eyes had deepened. Their partnership had evolved over time, each challenge faced together strengthening the bond between them. One autumn evening, as they sat on the expanded porch of the main house, now a substantial 2-story structure that accommodated their growing family while maintaining the warmth of the original homestead, Beatrice noticed Henry watching William and Emma as they argued good-naturedly over a ledger entry. "What are you thinking?" she asked, recognizing the contemplative expression on her husband's face. Henry smiled, reaching for her hand in a gesture that had become natural as breathing over their years together. "I was thinking about legacy," he admitted. "About what we'll leave behind when our time comes." Beatrice followed his gaze to their children, then looked beyond them to the ranch that had flourished under their care. "I'd say we've built something worth passing on. "It's more than the land or the cattle," Henry said softly. "It's what they've learned about hard work, about treating people fairly, about finding happiness in the life you build rather than the one you might have imagined." He squeezed her hand. "You taught me that, me." Beatrice looked at him in surprise. "How so?" "You could have given up that day in Val Verde. No one would have blamed you, but instead, you accepted help when it was offered and then built a new life from that foundation." He brought her hand to his lips, a gesture of reverence that still made her heart quicken after all their years together. "You showed me what real courage looks like." Beatrice felt her throat tighten with emotion. "We built this life together, Henry. Every day, every decision, it's been a partnership from the start." As the sun set over the Texas horizon, painting the ranch in hues of gold and amber, they sat in companionable silence, watching their children and contemplating the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace and prosperity. From desperate beginnings had grown a legacy of love and resilience that would endure long after they were gone, a testament to the power of one simple act of kindness and the courage to begin again. And so the story of Beatrice and Henry O'Malley became part of the rich tapestry of tales that defined the American frontier, not a story of gunslingers or outlaws, but of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges with dignity and determination. Their legacy lived on not just in the prosperous ranch that bore their name, but in the values they instilled in their children and the example they set for their community, a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, compassion could take root and flourish, transforming lives and creating home where once there had been only wilderness. For Beatrice, who had once stood hungry and alone on the streets of Val Verde, and for Henry, who had offered not just food but dignity and eventually his heart, the journey had come full circle. The hunger had been satisfied, the loneliness banished, and in its place had grown a love as enduring as the Texas landscape itself, proof that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest of invitations. Come home.